Today's topic will be for developing a strategy for your music career for 2021. So as we all know, 2021 is still looking very uncertain in terms of touring and gigging, even late in the year, but hopefully we'll be at that stage. But for now, we're going to look at some of the areas that are within our control when it comes to building your career and growing your fan base. So we'll be talking a lot about audience development and industry networking. So I'm going to hand things over to Matt now, who can introduce himself a bit more and let us know what we're going to be starting off with. All yours, Matt.
Thanks, Adam. Hi, everyone. Nice to see you. My name's Matt. It's been about 12 years now that I worked as a booking agent and manager, looking after about 40 different artists in that time and booking gigs in North America and Europe. Like Adam said, I studied at one of the conservatoires in London. So on my first day working at a booking agency, I was probably in the same situation as a lot of musicians, which was sort of knowing quite a lot about jazz, but not much or anything about the sort of business side of things, which I've kind of sort of learned along the way. So working as a booking agent and manager is kind of like, I guess it's a never-ending cycle of trying to figure out how to help the artists that I'm working with get more gigs, build their fan base, and basically just progress in the way they want to. I know a lot of musicians have this goal to get an agent or a manager, which is kind of understandable because, you know, you have this idea it would get you lots of gigs and just basically take everything else off your plate apart from making music. And obviously getting more people involved is a valid goal, but I think it's really important that you have this plan in place yourself to start making progress, because there's a lot of musicians out there, and I think the bar that agents and managers and labels set is getting higher and higher in terms of what they expect musicians to have sort of got to before they get on board. So obviously the music you're making is the most important thing, but what we're going to look at today is kind of all the other stuff that's important, in my opinion, to really make progress in terms of not just being a good musician, but being sort of a professional musician who's earning a living from making the music they want to make. For example, maybe you're making really good music, but you're not well known enough in the opinion of some clubs to get booked because they feel like they can't sell enough tickets. Or maybe you're making really good music, but the way you're presenting it to fans on social media or wherever you're active isn't sort of convincing them to go and buy it or come to see a gig. Or maybe it's just the case you're not connecting with the right people, so you release an album and you don't send it to the right journalists because you haven't maybe you don't know who they are. So like Adam said, for the last few years, I've run this website called Jazzfuel, and it just shares a lot of advice, both from myself and other industry guests who I interview, about how to sort of make progress with all of those things. And we're going to try and squeeze some of the most bits of that into the session today. I've got some things to share on my screen, so I'm just going to load that up. We actually did a survey with some musicians on the Jazzfuel mailing list about their sort of biggest struggles when it came to their career. And I just wanted to share some of those in case you could identify with them as well. If you've got your mic on, maybe you can let me know. So if we assume that the two long-term goals for most musicians are to get more gigs and sell more music, there's kind of three areas that we can sort of take control of ourselves right now, put a plan in place and start making progress, which is going to help with both those things. One of those is sort of industry networking. So how many people you know inside the industry and how you're connecting with them, and maybe how you can expand that group of people. The second is audience development. So obviously figuring out who your fans are right now and how you can connect with more of those people, so you can, obviously not just sell more music, but also create more of an atmosphere and more attention around your project. And lastly, how you're presenting it in the first place. Because like we said before, if you're making this great music, that's the most important thing. But if you're not actually convincing people to take action, whether that's a festival promoter or a fan sat in their bedroom in another country, it's going to be hard to sort of make that progress. So we're going to look at each of those three areas and try and figure out some sort of simple strategies that you can put in place to increase the progress with all of those. Just as an example, you can imagine if you had 10 times the number of people who call themselves fans of your music, then your next release would probably look a lot different in terms of financially, how many you could sell, and also how much attention you could get. Or similarly, if you had a 10x the number of journalists on your database that you could reach out to and get a response from, you'd probably be able to spread the news of your next release a bit further than you might otherwise. Obviously, this sounds quite like a sort of big goals to sort of get there, but actually the steps we can take along the way are quite small, and it's totally within everyone's reach, I think, to sort of put this in place, as long as you're doing some sort of consistent work on all these things, and you have a bit of a strategy and a bit of a plan, rather than just reacting to what happens and sort of maybe not being too organized about it. Instead, sort of putting in some careful time to plan how to make progress on each of those things. I've got a lot of stuff planned, because this concept of like how to plan your strategy for your career kind of could include anything or everything. So I think what we'll do is we're going to run through a bunch of different areas. If you've got questions at any time, you can post them in the chat box, or you can just shout, turn your mic on and ask. And if you want to get into any of them in more detail, I can sort of direct you to more resources afterwards. Okay, so the first section we look at is presenting your project. As I said before, making great music obviously is the most important thing, and that's kind of 100% your job to do. But we also need to make sure that when you do reach someone, whether that's a fan or a promoter or a journalist, that you're actually presenting it in a way that makes them interested to sort of check out more and sort of discover what you're doing. It's kind of less of an ongoing strategy and more something that you might sort of take a look at now, and then next time you release an album or sort of each campaign, sort of refresh how you're presenting your project and check sort of if you're happy with that. In terms of the content and how you're presenting yourself, there's kind of three main tools you've got at your disposal, which kind of dictate how people will check out your project, how they'll understand it, and if they'll like it. And that is, in my opinion, the images, videos, and words. And these three tools need to kind of convey the project as quickly as possible. They need to excite a promoter or a fan or a journalist to sort of discover it further. And they also need to show industry people how they might sell it, because if you're pitching for gigs, then obviously you need to convince the promoter that they like your music and they want to book you. But in most cases, promoters also need to sell some tickets. So they need to be shown how they can also sell you to their audience. And, obviously the music's the main thing, but being able to show them in video or photo or describe you with some really good text is an important tool for that promoter to have to be able to sell you as well. In terms of images, you've probably heard that phrase, a photo is worth 1,000 words, which I think is pretty accurate, even though you want people to judge on your music. Quite often they're actually going to see something about you on social media, in a magazine, on Spotify, on Bandcamp, before they actually hit that play button. And having those sort of like really stylish images is a really good way to draw them into your project. Let me just get the next one up. So just as an example, I wanted to share one of the photos from a band that I've worked with called Get the Blessing, who've sort of like over the last, 20 years probably now, sort of, they've stuck with this concept of making pretty quirky and interesting photos for every album campaign. And this is one from a few years ago with the orange bags on their heads. And this was taken from, a review in a French newspaper that used this photo. You then have here on the Berlin Jazz Festival that same year, a different photo from the same series, which again sticks with that theme, the orange bags. It's pretty eye-catching. I think you'll agree that if you saw that photo more than once, it would probably make some connection in your brain that, oh, I've seen that, I've seen those photos before, I've seen those guys with the bags on their heads. I've certainly had a lot of promoters tell me that before as well. Here's another one here in The Guardian. Again, out of all of these reviews, on this page here, there were probably 4 or 5 different bands getting reviewed, and inevitably this photo gets used sort of front and center because it's eye-catching, it's kind of fun, and it's certainly high quality as well. I have another one here from a blog in the UK using the photo. And lastly, the album cover that was included on a French radio website. And the reason I'm showing you this is just try to just show that when you have these great photos, and they don't have to be funny or quirky or weird like these, they just have to be sort of a style. If you have these, firstly, it leads to more exposure because people use them, like they get used on the front of magazine covers, they get used at the top of a review page of reviews in a magazine. And they also help fans in general just get used to who you are, because they see this pop up in a few different places, and then they sort of, it sticks in their memory much more than the classic musician photo, which is coming out of the studio and lining up against the brick wall and taking a photo of the band to use for the album. And there's actually a website, if you Google jazz musicians standing in front of brick walls, there's actually a website which lists, probably from the 1950s through to today, unbelievable amounts of legendary musicians and modern musicians who've done their promo shots in front of brick walls. It's kind of tongue-in-cheek, but I think you can probably also see the importance, the small impact that the small sort of advantage it helps you gain if you start to sort of put together this strong visual imagery around your project, both in terms of fans and in terms of promoters as well. I think a good story that kind of explains this. I was at the Jazz Ahead conference in Germany a couple of years ago, or a few years ago now, and I was sat with a German promoter of a big concert hall, and she was looking through the brochure of the showcases to decide what to see. And if you've been at Jazz Ahead before, you'll know that there are tons of showcases at the same time, so you can't see everything at the same time. You have to pick what to see, and there's no music because you're reading a brochure, and there's no way of checking. All you can do is look through it and decide what you want to go and see. And she was sat next to me, and she was looking through it, and she was basically looking at every photo and saying, okay, boring, boring, boring. Oh, that looks quite nice. I only want to see that one. And she was kind of joking, but also there was some truth in that, because if you're not able to make everyone sit down and listen to your album, then the visuals that you're using are really important. So I think as a starting point, it's worth revising, looking at what images you've got for your project. If you're happy with them, if they really do sort of create an atmosphere that you think is sort of sits next to your music very well, then you're in good shape. Otherwise, it's worth putting some plans in place for actually seeing how you can improve that. Obviously, if we're talking about visuals, videos are kind of even more important. I'd say that it's the most essential promo tool you can have. Certainly as a booking agent, I couldn't imagine representing a band who didn't have a good video, because it's much easier and much more realistic to get a promoter or a journalist or even a fan to watch a 2 or 3 minute video and understand the music straight away than to expect them to, read what you've written, go and listen to some stuff on Spotify, download the album, and really dig into it like that. And that's not just sort of like anecdotal. I mean, I actually have experiences, firstly, of talking to promoters. We did a survey with Jazzfuel with about 80 jazz promoters. And one of the most interesting stats that came up was that 60% of them said that video content was very important in the decision to book a band. If you look at that the other way, that could be saying that if you don't have a good video, there's kind of at least 60% of gigs that you're going to find it very hard to get. And with that in mind, even though I know making a video is not a quick or necessarily cheap thing to do, it's certainly worth putting some plans in place to get that done. I certainly had the experience early on with an artist, probably about 12 years ago now, of pitching to lots of clubs and festivals and getting pretty much no response. And then we made a music video and we repitched all the same people, and we had like at least 3 or 4 solid offers that same week. Not because the music had changed at all, not because his profile had changed at all, but simply because they could understand it now. They weren't reading some text and then thinking, oh, shall I go and find this record and listen to it and learn about it or whatever. They could literally press play and they could see it. And for the ones that didn't come back and book it, that was probably because it wasn't their thing, but at least they could know that. And as a booking agent, I think that's the main thing you want, is you want every promoter to actually understand the project and consider it. The worst thing you could imagine is that people are not booking it because they don't understand it, or they don't even know about it. And a video is a really good way to get people to sort of understand the music. In terms of putting that together, you've got a few options these days. Obviously, and I'm going to send these links afterwards if you want to watch these videos in full. We won't sit and watch them now. Obviously, you've got sort of full music videos, so you can, hire someone with a camera, edit it, put the album track behind, sort of record it in super high quality. These tend to be very effective, but also kind of a lot of work to get together. More and more common these days are sessions. So you probably all know sort of balcony TV or the what's it called, Sofa Sounds, or any of these. And whilst they might not be great in terms of paid work, they're really good at giving you video content. So if you're not able to get together a video yourself, investigating some of these sessions is a really good way to get some high quality video content and also to reach a wider audience as well. And then also live videos, which I've sort of added with live stream, given what's been going on in 2020. You know, firstly, live videos, quite a lot of clubs and festivals now film gigs. So actually searching out those specific gigs and negotiating that they give you the footage afterwards is a really easy way. And actually, in terms of booking gigs, I know a lot of promoters who've said that they prefer live video because it really lets them understand what the band's like. There's no sort of like a studio track playing in the background. It's actually, they get to see what the band is like on stage. You can also do that yourself, of course. You can, you know, go to a local jazz club, or if you've got a gig, you know, arrange for someone to come and film it. But this is a really useful tool. And actually, this band that you see on screen here, Binker and Moses, obviously this was taken on the Jules Holland TV show, which is much bigger. But when I first started working with them, all they had as a video content was the a video from So Far Sounds in London. And that was enough for us to book a bunch of gigs because it captured the energy of the show. It was good enough quality that promoters realized it was a serious project. And, you know, and obviously you sort of aim to upgrade your videos every so often, but that was really a great tool for us to book a bunch of gigs for that band. In terms of live stream videos, because, you know, we want to talk a bit about that, I think it's something that is probably more on the audience development side, but there are some really good examples of musicians using these opportunity to sort of stream gigs from home or from local venues and put it out there. And not just, maybe not in terms of like getting gigs or getting press coverage, but in terms of actually reaching fans when everything else is shut down. And whilst I don't know about you guys, but I certainly got a bit bored with all the live streams that were just sort of done as a reaction to the situation. But out of that, there were certain ones that popped up that were really done thoughtfully and creatively, and really, I think, helped those bands make a lot of progress because it really helped create an extra connection between them and the audience. And I think it also showed promoters that, you know, who the proactive bands were during that time. So I think, you know, it's not for everyone, but I think investigating live stream is another sort of an extra thing to consider when you're thinking about video content for your project. And then the third sort of area of content in terms of presenting yourself is text. I mean, it's not as sort of exciting as videos and photos, but, you know, especially as an agent, the first the first thing we have to get through when we're trying to pitch a project is to get through someone's inbox and into their ears. And the same with pitching for press coverage as well. You know, you have a journalist and he's only reading emails, or she obviously. You want them to read this piece of text and be motivated enough to click the listen link. You're not expecting this text to sort of sell a project by itself, but you are expecting it to be exciting enough and engaging enough to make people curious to take the next step. Obviously, you can have different types of text depending on what you're working on. And, you know, obviously, as we're focusing on booking gigs and getting press, there's two sort of examples there of what you might do. And I just wanted to share an example from that same band with the photos of a sort of a press text that they had at some point. And I'll share these slides later in case you want to look at these again. So what I'd sort of suggest that all of you do right now is sort of go back and look on your website, look on your Facebook page, look on your bio, wherever else you have text, and sort of think to yourself, does this read not just well, but does this make people excited to take the next step and listen to my music? You know, it doesn't have to give you a whole life story. It doesn't have to list all the musicians that you've shared a stage with because they came to college when you were studying. It just has to sort of give a bit of a taste of the music, which I think this example does quite well. And it has to sort of move people on to the next step. in terms of sort of pulling all this together, there's an old thing called an old sort of marketing concept called the rule of 7, which says that people need to hear your message at least 7 times before it really sinks in. And that can be a written message, it can be visual as well. And I came across this example from the Bad Plus. This is a screenshot from their website at the moment. And you can see this sort of like these chairs in the background, and then you have this advertising for upcoming gigs. If you look at their Facebook page as well, you have exactly the same graphics here. And you look at their Bandcamp as well, and you have the chairs as well. I know this seems like a really sort of small detail, especially when you're sort of working to create your musical project. And in some ways it is a detail. But if you're sort of like really trying to come up with a strategy to work on, you know, consistently over the next 10 or 20 years, then bringing all these little details together is very important, because there's so much great music out there. And if you can sort of use all these little extra ways to make people remember who you are, then that can be really important as well. Just because we touched on websites and I said I'd talk a bit about that, I think, you know, out of all these places where you can be putting your content, social media, Spotify, Bandcamp, the website is the one where you've got sort of 100% control. In theory, your website can look however you want it, which is a really good thing, but it's also a bit of a dangerous thing, because it means that it can look bad as well. And so I think one thing to be aware of is, you know, a website doesn't have to be expensive anymore. In fact, it should be almost free. It doesn't have to be flashy, it doesn't have to do lots of important things, but it does have to be simple, and it does have to act as a hub. It has to direct people to all of your best content, and it has to be up to date, because whilst a good website is kind of expected now, a bad website can kind of make, especially industry people, feel that the project is maybe a bit unloved, a bit of a part-time project, not really a focus, or that the people behind it are maybe not on top of all the other types of things as well. You know, I've been to websites where there's gigs, upcoming gigs from a year ago, old album things, broken links. Again, these are all sort of details that when they're added up over many years, it does make a difference. So I just wanted to share this quick list about what I think is the most important content to have on your website, which I'll let you take a quick look at now, and then I'll also share afterwards. So that was the first section of stuff we were going to talk about the sort of the content and presenting yourself. So I wanted to stop and see if anyone had any questions or comments or experiences they wanted to mention about that. Either you can write in the chat box, or you can unmute your microphone if you want to talk about that at all.
That was very insightful. Thank you, Matt.
Thanks. I can't see where that's coming from.
From Leon.
Thanks.
That's great. I just have a couple of comments on it, actually, Matt, really quickly, if that's okay.
Yeah, please.
I think one of the best bits of kind of feedback I got many years ago is that images should emote, that images should convey some sort of emotion. If an image doesn't emote in some way, it's not an effective image. So when I'm looking at images, I'm always like, if they tell a story, you know, they should have the capacity to tell a story. They can be very powerful that way. And the jazz musician standing in front of brick walls, I mean, I know I've seen that link so many times. I mean, and it's used, and but it is so on point, you know, because with you know, with artists, you know, obviously they're you know, working hard on the music, and you could have a 5-hour rehearsal session, and then the photo is kind of this like thing at the end of the day where everyone looks maybe a little bit sad or depressed for having spent so much time in the studio, and you know, then that's kind of captured forever, and that's not really you know, the way it goes. So that's one thing I just wanted to say on that. And the other thing is you said some of the videos during lockdown, you know, the live stream, everyone got a bit fatigued with that. Were there any particular lockdown videos that like stood out to you? You know, you mentioned that some of them were better than others. Are there any that you sort of went, or any like, you know, production house or company that you said, okay, these people are doing it right?
Yeah, I mean, it was less about the quality, to be honest, and more of the sort of like the intention behind it. There's like a Scottish duo called Bancroft and Line, Sophie Bancroft, and they did this thing called the Monday night session, and they did it from their living room, and they sort of, the whole sort of like the branding of it was they invited people into their living room, and there was interaction, and they were going through all their back catalogue and jazz standards every Monday without fail, and then they released an album called the Monday Night Sessions. So I thought that felt much more like a considered thing that could have been done anytime, you know, COVID or not, which just sort of, I don't know, it just felt more organic and more like there was a point to it than just like the quite understandable reaction of like the gigs are cancelled physically, so let's just do it from home. So for me, it was less about the quality, although obviously that is important, and more about the sort of like there being a bit of a strategy or plan or momentum behind it.
Continuity, yeah. Yeah. The other thing I just remembered about images, I just wanted to flag it because this has come up so many times before. Like the people who may book your project, your band, are not necessarily the people who need to market that to sell tickets. So always consider, you know, the marketing department. What their concern is, if it is like a festival that has a large number of people working on it, for example. The person who books the band isn't necessarily the person who goes ahead and sets that into the brochure and does all of those things. It is the people in like marketing and public relations who have to do that. And those are the people who are just starved for quality images. And they have a completely different mindset to publishing events than, let's say, the person who booked your band. So yeah, I just think it's a really important thing to consider, because I've seen loads of festival programs where the headliner isn't necessarily on the cover of the program. But it's a band, you know, it could be, you know, it's a band that could be anywhere on the bill, but it's the image that the marketing department has decided, this is such a good image, we cannot waste it. So that's, I suppose, speaks again to the power of having, you know, this kind of killer image that has an emotion, you know, and or has something mysterious about, or whatever, you know, something that kind of invites more or captures your eye, you know. So I just wanted to mention that. And my last question, sorry if I'm hogging, apologies. You know, websites, obviously they're your own hub, and you can sort of direct out to all of your other platforms, be it Bandcamp, Instagram, SoundCloud, you know, all those things, Twitter. Is having a website in 2021 as important now that, like, you know, things seem to be sort of decentralized? You know, and people's, you know, people's platforms, you know, people are increasingly, when they're presenting a project, they're pointing to their Instagram as their primary link, for example, or, you know what I mean? So the springboard seems to be more focused on social media, but do you think that there is value still in having this kind of your own branded central hub?
Yeah, I do. I don't think you'd expect people to use it as much as they would your Instagram or Facebook, but I feel like you have the control, and if, like, you know, Instagram goes the way of MySpace or whatever, then it's good you've got people there. And the fact that it's completely customizable, you can send people there to watch a secret video on a hidden page, or you can send people there to sign up to your mailing list, and you can sign people there to hit your I still think the fact that it's so customizable makes it important. But it's true, I don't think it's like the primary place that you're sending fans, but I do think it's important. And I can't see websites disappearing before Instagram or Bandcamp or anything like that, Mike.
Good point. Yeah.
I think we have a question in. Jane Hackett wants to ask a question. You there, Jane?
Hi. Yeah. Thanks. Hi, Matt. Really interesting. I'm Jane, and I'm a classical violinist. So I'm kind of, it's really interesting coming from like a different kind of side almost, and looking at things in a different way. I just wondered, do you have any experience in promoting classical musicians at all, or do you work mainly with jazz musicians and bands?
Yeah, I'm working mainly with jazz. I mean, I guess we have some experience of like concerts at philharmonic halls or like musicians with orchestras, but that's always with some sort of jazz connection. So I haven't really worked like in any sort of straight classical setting before.
Okay. Yeah. No, that's okay. Thanks.
Okay. So I think we'll carry on. Shall we, Adam?
Yeah. If there's no other questions, we'll move on to the next section.
Cool. Okay. Let me just share my screen again.
Sorry, before you continue, Matt, if I might just take 2 seconds to say something.
Sure.
In relation to what Jane was just saying. You know, in a way, I work very similar to you. I have a group of artists, and part of what I do with them is manage them, but I also help in their promotion and their publicity and so on. And now there's a particular artist who is going to release an album either at the end of February or the end of March, who I work with, who is London based, and all of a sudden that artist isn't a jazz artist. You know, everybody I work with so far, and as I say, you and I have worked together as well in the past, and it's all been jazz related. But this particular artist is now, you know, she's more Kate Bush than she is jazz. And just keeping it in relation to what Jane was asking, the challenge I find from that point, and I think it's a question that Jane is asking, is as jazz industry people, we have all our contact lists, be it promoters or be it journalists or radio or whatever, all lined up along jazz lines. And suddenly working with this new project that's coming up, the challenge for me is suddenly having to reach out to either find a whole bunch of new contacts or reach out to a whole new bunch of contacts. And it's a challenge because it's like starting from square A again. So if there's an answer to Jane's point, the answer, I suppose, is if you are going to start working with somebody or start either working with somebody on promotion or publicity of you, you really first want to make sure that person is steeped in classical music. When you start looking at PR people outside your genre, they're just not as well equipped, and they really don't have the contact lists, and they don't know where the classical festivals are, and they don't know where the classical journalists are, and so on. So just tuppence word on that subject, Matt.
Yeah, nice. Yeah, I mean, it's like starting in from zero, isn't it? So
yeah.
But I guess that's what some musicians, jazz musicians, who are starting now to build their connections and everything, they're in the same position. So it's the same, a lot of the same processes and the same concepts. It's just with a different group of people. So I think it's all applicable. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen if I can. Okay, so next I just want to talk a bit about audience development. So this is kind of the areas that you're working on to steadily increase the number of fans that you're connected with. This could be either sort of strengthening your engagement with existing followers, or it could be introducing your project to new ones. And ideally, you're going to be working on both of those things at the same time. As we mentioned, obviously, this has a direct impact in terms of selling more gig tickets or selling more music if you're actually connecting with more people. But also it helps the wider career as well, because, you know, even just in terms of getting gigs, if you can sort of demonstrate you've got a bigger reach, that's definitely a positive factor when it comes to sort of expanding to getting booked for gigs. It's probably worth mentioning that we're not talking about like Facebook likes and Spotify follows and things like this. We're talking about sort of real fans who are going to like actually spend money on your project or support it in some other way. You know, as you point out, a like on Facebook is, you know, it's not actually a true fan. This sort of concept of true fans, I don't know if any of you've heard of this before. It's written by a guy called Kevin Kelly, who was the editor, or they called him the senior maverick at Wired magazine, and he's written a ton of really brilliant essays. And this one was called 1,000 True Fans, which you can Google to sort of read in full. But the key concept, which I've kind of tweaked to make it specific for jazz, is that to be a successful jazz musician, you don't need millions of euros, millions of gigs, or millions of fans. You just need 1,000 true fans. Firstly, when I say successful, what we're talking about here is being able to live just by, you know, making the music you want to make, you know, if that's your goal, not having to teach or doing any other types of music, you know, just to create your music and earn the living that you want from that. And also this number of 1,000 is not the sort of like a fixed number. This is the concept that, you know, it might be a bit less, it might be a bit more, but it's the idea that you don't need this unimaginable amount of people to support your project to get to where you want to go. You could almost count them if you had enough time, these people, and you can imagine over 10 years, you know, building this up gradually, you can actually hit this number. There's no reason why anyone here can't connect with that number of people out of how many billion people there are in the world. So it's actually just this concept of how we can connect with those people and convert them from people who don't know us to people who've heard our music and who kind of like it, to people who are actually, you know, really strong supporters who will buy everything you make, who will come to a gig when it's within 200 miles of where they're going, who try and convert all their friends to like your music as well. This is what I mean by a true fan. You know, building up this engagement with fans can look different depending on how and where you're engaged with people. Excuse me. But in this session, we're going to look at three main areas: Facebook, mailing list, and Spotify. And there are others we could have talked about, but I think these are three of the biggest ones, and also a lot of the concepts are the same. So basically what we're thinking about is how we can provide maximum value on each of these places to convert people from sort of casual passers-by to actual sort of super fans. And, you know, a typical journey might look like this: that someone sees you on YouTube, they come across you on social media, a gig, on a playlist, in press, on Bandcamp, or anywhere else you can think of. And, you know, if they like it, which won't be all of them, then you could sort of describe them as a social fan. So they are, you know, they might like you on one of those platforms, or they might just, you know, you're in their sphere of consciousness, they know about you and they like it. Traditionally, you try and get these people onto your mailing list to really sort of have that more one-to-one connection, which social media doesn't really provide, with the goal of then, you know, strengthening that relationship to be able to call them a super fan. Obviously, it doesn't always look like this. It's not sort of exact science. Especially these days, you have bands selling out tours on Instagram, you know, without even thinking about a mailing list. But I still think that's a sort of a relevant sort of stage to factor in if you're trying to sort of think about how you might plan a strategy for this across the whole year. So what I'm going to do is just talk a little bit about each of those three areas, and we'll sort of take questions on each of those. I'm just going to stop the screen share a second. Okay. So firstly, mailing list. Who here has got a mailing list? You can just show by like putting your hand up if you're on mute. Okay, some. So what I thought I would do is just sort of talk from just give you the sort of the quick run through from the sort of the absolute basics through to a bit more sort of advanced techniques. So basically what we're talking about is getting people to give you permission to send them emails. We're not talking about adding people to a mailing list. We're not talking about emailing promoters or journalists. We're talking about fans and permission marketing. So getting them to agree that you can send them emails whenever you like. The reason we want to do this, firstly, according to some studies, it's 40 times more effective to email someone than to reach them on social media. So if you're trying to sell your music, being able to get in someone's inbox and have them interested to open your mails and see what you're going to say is going to help you up to 40 times more when you want to sell gig tickets, sell music, or, you know, get people to take any other sort of action. Obviously, as a sort of basic, for those of you that haven't got a mailing list yet, you need to firstly sign up to get one. Maybe someone like MailChimp. There's plenty of free providers out there. And you need to create those forms which give people the ability to actually give you their email address. That's the absolute basics. I'm sure you all know what that looks like when you go to a website and there's a subscribe button. Taking that one step further, you should also have a landing page, which is a dedicated page on your website, which isn't necessarily visible from the menu. It's a page that when someone arrives on it, it has a sign up form and maybe a little bit more information, but nothing else. So there's no distractions, there's no videos, there's no upcoming gigs. It's purely a page which is focused on getting someone's email address. So if you can, you know, it should take maybe an hour maximum if you haven't yet done this to sign up for a mailing list, create a form, and create a landing page on your website. You're kind of good to go with that. So the next stage we have to go through is then firstly how to grow your list, because obviously the more people you've got on your list, the more people you can reach with your important news and updates. I'd sort of always say it seems very simple, but firstly, just starting with your existing fans, friends, family, anyone you can think of, because you just want to get that momentum going. So you've got your mailing list running and growing. So sending a note personally to everyone who you know, telling them, hey, I'm going to start sending out some exclusive content just on email. I'd really like to send it to you. Can I add you, or can you go to this link here to my landing page and sign up as a step one? Once you've got that done, it's worth thinking about incentives. For those of you who've got a mailing list already, you probably know that the growth of that list can be pretty slow. If you imagine how many people come into your website, which maybe isn't many per day, and then also you know, how many of those choose to sign up, can be very low. The important thing to think of is how you can incentivize someone to give you their email address, because people are more and more protective of their emails these days. I don't know about you, but I get a lot of emails from like newsletters that I've signed up for, newsletters I haven't signed up for. People try and keep their inbox a bit clean these days. So it's hard to persuade someone just by having a subscribe button on your website. So what's really important is think of what you can give someone. Sometimes you call it a bribe, in return for their email address. Now, maybe 5 or 10 years ago, you could give someone a free download because people listen to downloaded music and they'd be happy to give you their email address in return for this. These days, that's kind of a little harder because people don't really download music so much with streaming being around. So you need to think a bit more sort of out the box on what you can offer someone. There's no sort of, there's no restriction on what you can come up with for this. Some common ones would be, for example, unreleased video content, unreleased music, chord charts, lyric sheets. Maybe you have a Facebook group, which is just exclusive people on your mailing list. Maybe you offer a free download of I don't know, a transcriptions book, or anything you can think of. If you can get into the mindset of thinking of who do you want to get onto your mailing list and what would they like that you could offer them in return for that. So this is a really important thing to have in place. And once you've got this in place, you don't need to keep thinking about it. You know, you set this up once, and then that's going to probably be okay for the next year or so. So it's worth spending a bit of time now on that to sort of get the benefits later. If you go to my Jazzfuel site, obviously I'm not a musician, so it's slightly different. You'll see on lots of pages, I use these incentives. So I'll have a guide to something, and then I'll say, download the PDF version of this here. And you click on it and you give your email address and you get it. And I've got about, I think I've got about 4,000 subscribers now, and I think more than half of those came through one of those offers. So only a small percentage came from people who just decided to sign up. All the rest came from people who wanted something in return. It's just kind of a deal. So as long as that what you're offering them is sort of in line with your artistic sort of presence, not that you're offering them like, I don't know, a discount for Amazon or something, you're offering them something related to your music, then it's a good way to get that relationship started. Once you've got that decided, obviously you want to advertise that fact on your website. And if you've got a dedicated landing page, you also advertise it there. And what that means is you can then tell people on Facebook and Instagram and YouTube and anywhere else, hey, you can get this unreleased video, or you can get this, you know, this private SoundCloud stream by going to this page here, and they click on the link and they arrive on a page which says, give us your email address and your name, and we'll send you this, what we just promised you. It's a really common sort of tool in a lot of marketing online, and one that's kind of quite underused by musicians, I think. So if you think that sounds like an interesting idea, I'd sort of say try and get that set up in the next couple of days. It doesn't take a lot of time, and see how it works and try and sort of drive some traffic there. So once you've got that in place, obviously you need to make sure people see that offer. So one way is to just schedule some newsletters, schedule some social media posts, and just make sure you're talking about it regularly, what they can get for going to your website and signing up. And the second way is just to simply add it to all your calls to actions on social media. So in your Twitter bio, on your Instagram, everywhere you've got your sort of little bio somewhere, rather than just linking to your website, say, you know, link to that specific page where they can get that free thing and tell them about it. And you can change this up every so often and, you know, see what works better than others. But the idea is you're going to sort of like massively increase the number of people who are willing to give you their email address because you're offering them something in return. So once you've sort of got that in place, in theory, it can kind of keep running by itself. That's why I guess it's a good strategy, because it's not something that's going to take your time every day or every week. It's something you put a bit of effort in now, and then it's going to keep running sort of indefinitely, in theory, if you get it right and you keep pushing traffic to it. Then the other side of this would be how you're actually engaging with people who join your mailing list. bit like Facebook likes, getting someone on your mailing list on its own doesn't really count for anything. I mean, just because you've got their email address doesn't mean they're reading what you send them, doesn't mean they're buying your music or buying tickets. You have to figure out ways to actually engage them. Firstly, so that when they see you in their inbox, they're interested to open it. I don't know about you, but I've got some newsletters that arrive in my inbox, and every time they arrive, I open them straight away and read them, because I know they're always interesting, always relevant, always timely, and others that I delete or save for later. And obviously you want to be in that first camp. So finding out ways to keep your emails short, concise, focused on something specific, providing value, not selling all the time, not trying to tell people to buy tickets to your gig, not waiting until your next album before you email people, getting into this routine of emailing people regularly with interesting and sort of personal content. I'd probably advise for most people not to write in the third person, like write, you know, people want to hear from you personally. They don't want to hear from your manager or your publicist or someone. They want to hear from you because, you know, probably more now than ever, people appreciate this personal contact with musicians. So, you know, tell them something interesting that you've been doing musically and send them a link to the rehearsal, or, you know, think about what you'd like to receive if you were them and actually send interesting information. And, you know, I think you'll weed out the people that aren't real fans anyway, and you'll build a much stronger connection with people who are interested in what you're doing. So that's something to keep in mind. If you're just getting started with mailing lists, I think that's enough in terms of getting a plan in place to start growing it, and then having a plan to contact them. You know, put it in your diary every week or every month. You're going to send a mail out on this day, and do it without fail. You know, even if you've got nothing to say, force yourself to come up with something interesting. You can save stuff up from before, just to keep that regularity going. I don't remember the actual figure, but there was some stat about, you know, when you don't hear from someone for more than like a month or two, the unsubscribe rates just skyrocket, because people forget they signed up, they're not sure who you are, it's not relevant anymore, and they just stop reading it. And, you know, going back to what we said at the start about this 40 times engagement on email, if you can build up, you know, imagine if you have 500 people on your mailing list and 20% of them are opening and taking action, then, you know, potentially that's 100 albums you've sold straight away when you release your next record, which, you know, would be I think for everyone here would be a important, like a step forwards compared to not having that at all. For those of you that have got sort of already got this up and running and maybe a bit more advanced with it, I guess just two things to mention that are really interesting to do once you get a slightly bigger list is firstly to segment your list. So you're trying to create that impression that you're writing personally to everyone by only sending them the most relevant information. So an easy example would be segmenting them geographically. So you don't send a guy in New York news about your London gig and vice versa. Or you segment people who've bought your record and people you haven't. So you don't send sales mails to people who've already bought your record. You can send them something else more valuable for them. There's a lot of information online about this. I can point you in the right direction if you're sort of at the stage of wanting to do that. But it's just an important thing to have in mind. And just the other thing, the last thing to mention on that will be to set up welcome emails. So these are automated pre-written emails that when someone signs up to your list, they receive an email from you thanking them for joining. Then 3 or 4 days later, they receive another email with a little story about your first gig with this band and a link to the video. And a few days later, something else. And what this does, it means that by the time they start receiving your newsletter, you know they know your project because they've heard this, they've seen this, they've read this, they've signed up to this, rather than just immediately starting to email people with your latest news, regardless of whether they've known you for 10 years or whether they just saw you on Twitter and decided to sign up. So that's sort of important thing to think about. I've just seen a message here. Let me just answer this comment. Geosegmentation is great, but geotagging doesn't work if you import emails from elsewhere like Bandcamp. On a lot of providers, on mine, for example, once you start emailing someone from your email provider, it tracks their IP address and estimates where they are. So in theory, if you import subscribers from Bandcamp, once you've emailed them a couple of times, most email providers will be able to tell you where they're based, roughly, like city or country. If that doesn't work on yours, then maybe have a look at some alternatives, but it should work in theory. Did anyone else have any other questions about mailing lists? I know that was kind of a quick, like, rush through it. No.
Yes, I had one.
Sure.
Sorry, Matt. Once more of a comment, really. I noticed the importance of mailing lists recently, in regard to, with online concerts. And I noticed there was a group that had an online concert, and they were, I suppose, relying on the Facebook event page to notify people of the time, date of the event. But I noticed that a lot of their audience or their fans were not getting links from that event, or were not getting reminders. So I thought about that the mailing list is probably a more certain way of getting a direct message to your fans or your audience about an event, rather than relying on, say, Facebook event links or invites.
Exactly. I mean, with all of those platforms, you're totally reliant on them and their algorithms and what they want to show to your fans. Whereas an email address, and until email sort of disappears, that's a personal connection that no other platform can take away from you. So yeah, it's massively valuable for things like that, for sure. Yeah. I mean, it's like all those musicians that amassed like 1 million followers on MySpace, and then overnight it just disappeared, and they've got no way to contact them now. So yeah, definitely important.
Just wondering, how often would you recommend sending out the email to your mailing list followers? I mean, I know you need to keep it interesting and exciting for the readers, but there mightn't necessarily be something very exciting going on, on a regular basis.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think there's one size fits all for everyone. So I think you can sort of test that a bit. I think in terms of not having content to do, you can probably sort of think of themes, and obviously if it's just gigs and releases, then for sure you won't have stuff to publish all the time. But maybe you decide, okay, I'm gonna, I've seen musicians who, for example, who do like a transcription videos or something, or they make mixtapes on Spotify or whatever, or different platforms of music, and creating interesting stuff. So it definitely would push you sort of to come up with new ideas that your people would be interested in. I think I'd say every month would be, in my opinion, that would be a good sort of minimum. Like I wouldn't leave it much longer than that. Apart from that, it really depends. Like I've got on my email list, I email like every 3 days for the first like 3 weeks, and the engagement's higher then than any other time later. So and I think also maybe if people start to unsubscribe, maybe then that's okay, because you're not going after this vanity metric of total subscribers. You're going after like how many people are really interested in what you've got to say. So I think as long as you're happy about that, then as frequently as you can. But yeah, every 3 or 4 weeks, I would say would be do at least that.
Super, thank you.
Sure.
I'm just wondering about something. Like if I use Bandcamp for a lot of my emails that are sent out, I leave certain messages. Let's say this is the new album, etc., etc. And I have fans that are getting that. Am I better off just stopping doing that with Bandcamp and just focus completely on mailing lists, rather than the fan getting dual emails?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I actually hosted I hosted a Q&A with one of the guys from Bandcamp a couple of weeks ago, and I asked him that as well.
Right.
I think, and there wasn't a straight answer, but I think Bandcamp's a really interesting community of people who really buy music. And so I think if they like receiving your messages there, I'd keep sending them there, because I think what you can do, what we've done before, is like you can tag people in your email provider with whatever you want. So potentially tagging people if they're on your Bandcamp list, tagging them like that. So then you can say, going back to sort of segmentation, you can say, send this email to everyone who's not on Bandcamp, and don't send it to people who are on Bandcamp.
I see. Yeah.
Take a bit more setup. But I do think Bandcamp's a bit specific, because it is like, for a lot of bands, it's really how they make 90% of their physical sales. So
for sure.
Think about
Great.
it like that.
Thanks.
Sure.
There was a question from in the chat, Matt, before you move on.
Yeah.
From, I you just see it, do you see it there?
Oh, yeah. Is there a good criteria by which you can judge whether some content, like a short video or sketch, should be email newsletter subscriber specific or something you send to all your social media followers? Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of a different medium. So you wouldn't necessarily have to send it to one or the other. I think email, I mean, firstly, you can use your email newsletter to direct people to something on Facebook. So for example, you could post your new video on Facebook and then email your newsletter to tell them about it. So you can they're kind of interconnected like that as well. I think in general, if you can come up with something you think is worthy of being in someone's inbox, you know, yeah, I mean, I think it's got to be valuable, but then again, part of what we were going to talk about today as well is like making your social media content as valuable as possible. So I use it in both ways. I use my mailing list to sort of highlight new things or things I guess just I think are more clickable or interesting or valuable. But I don't know I don't think there's a specific criteria, at least not for me.
What would you say, Matt, about a mailing list being kind of a summary of kind of stuff that an artist did on social media in the past like 4 weeks? You know what I mean? If they're active on different hubs, I mean, is that diluting message, or is that?
I think, I mean, I've always found that it's good to try and have one message in a mail, because I feel like the goal is to get people to do something, like either that's click a link, watch something, go somewhere. So I found like when I've tried having lots of different things in one email, people tend to click on one of them just at random. So I'd rather say like make an email for each of those things if they're important enough. But also I think with all this thing, like you can test it, and if your newsletter people react well to that, then yeah, good.
It sounds like you go pretty forensic on looking at, you know, how each mail that you send performs. And it sounds like a lot of work, you know, I'll be honest. But, you know, it's obviously important to trim it into something that you know is going to be effective more often than this, you know, the general. Do you use MailChimp yourself, or do you? I'm sure you've jumped around platforms.
No, I use this thing called ConvertKit, which is kind of designed for sort of bloggers and freelancers and things, which is, I mean, yeah, it does lots of good things.
Okay. But you have used MailChimp in the past, I would imagine.
Yeah, I used to use MailChimp. Yeah, I prefer this other one because it's sort of like, it's very low design. Like if you've seen, I guess you've seen my newsletters, but there's no images and there's no font colors, there's nothing else. What I sort of like feel like is like people should think you're writing to them personally. You should always merge the first name tag, so it says hi Ken or whatever in the start, and you should read it back and think, does this seem like I'm writing to them, not like am I just broadcasting news? That's why the segmentation is good as well. So I'm a big fan of like no design at all. I know some people are the complete opposite, but I like
again, test your market and see what works for you, I guess. But certainly, as we all know at IMC, designing emails is a PITA, as they say in the trade. So I think Alan Smith has a question, and then we'll let you move on, Matt.
It's nothing to do with the existing topic.
Sure.
It's a question. Have you about live music? Have you ever heard an Irish jazz musician playing in England?
Yeah, yes.
Had he got a name?
Yeah, I mean, I don't live in England, by the way, but I.
Oh, sorry. Where do you live in?
I live in Paris. Yeah, I mean, I actually worked with an Irish singer.
An Irish jazz musician playing in France?
Probably not, although I don't go to many gigs in France.
Okay, well, there is one playing in Marseille.
Oh yeah.
Called Gérard, en français, Gérard Murphy.
Okay.
He's an alto player, and he teaches in Marseille, and he plays on the scene down there.
Very good. Yeah, I don't know the Marseille jazz scene very well, but I'll check it out.
I had the John Connaughton Quartet in Lyon for a few years.
Nice. Yeah, there's normally some Irish in every city, right?
We try and get around, yeah.
They're everywhere.
Nice. Okay, I mean, we've got a lot of stuff to go through and I know time's running out. So I guess, would you be more interested in talking a bit about Facebook or Spotify? If anyone wants to say.
Can we get if you want to use the reaction button to
Facebook, perhaps?
Dara, that's one for Facebook.
I'm Spotify.
Yeah, Spotify too here.
Yeah.
For Spotify. I can't hear anybody else.
Facebook, thank you.
Two. Okay, we're tied at the moment, folks.
Bunch of Spotify.
Oh, wait a minute. We got one, two, three. Yeah, I think Spotify is edging it out, Matt.
All right, I'll send some notes on Facebook afterwards. But like,
great.
Yeah, I mean, so I know there's a lot of mixed feelings about Spotify between musicians, but we're not really talking about it in this session as an income generator. We're talking about it as a way to, as a discovery tool, a way to build audiences. And if your music is on there and you sort of can use it cleverly, it is a good way to get new people to hear your music. And the reason for that, I mean, this is not just, again, it's not a vanity metric of getting more people to listen to you for almost free. The goal is that, a percentage of those, a small percentage, will then decide they want to learn more, and they'll look you up on Bandcamp or on Facebook or anywhere else, and you can sort of then start to sort of engage with them as a real fan. Admittedly, that's it's a small percentage, and that's part of the way it works. But I think it's it's not going anywhere, and it's important to like if you've got your music on there, to do it justice by putting a few good things in place with that. I mean, just as the basics, I guess maybe everyone knows this already, but just, in terms of getting set up, everyone should have their artist for Spotify account set up. And that obviously lets you log in and customize the way your profile looks on Spotify. And you should take full advantage of that in terms of uploading your images, again, the same ones as your website and Facebook and all those other places. So the branding is consistent. And putting your social media links, your bio, getting all that up to scratch. Also putting your gigs on Spotify once gigs come back, because if you put your gigs on Songkick, the website, which it's a free website, they'll automatically appear on your Spotify profile. And then, which is kind of a cool feature, anyone who follows you will be notified if you play in their city, which you can imagine if you keep amassing followers over the next 10 years, that could be a really valuable tool. You have a gig in Manchester or something, and there's 35 people who follow you on Spotify, and they're all notified by email that you're playing in Manchester, and here's the date and here's the ticket link. For something that takes a few minutes maximum to set up, it's pretty worth having in place. So obviously, as the basics, getting your profile set up. What you can also do on your artist for Spotify thing is connect playlists to your profile. So you can create playlists, and then you can attach them so that when people come to your artist page on Spotify, they can see your playlists. And I'd suggest for every musician to have 2 playlists. And that would be firstly, one which is kind of like your complete discography. So any music you've released as a playlist. And secondly, a sort of creative playlist. So you come up with a theme of some sort. So it could just be, what you're listening to at the moment, or it could be, the best 1940s albums, or, something that's sort of close to you and also close to your project. It could be, crossover music from South America, or, you get the idea. One playlist which you update regularly with sort of interesting music of other bands that's close enough to what you're doing that you can also slip a couple of yours in there as well. I'd sort of consider that as part of the general setup of Spotify, having those playlists there, because it means people aren't just going to listen to your music and leave again. They're actually able to hang around and engage with what you're doing. And in a lot of ways, these playlists are kind of like mixtapes that, a lot of us were probably making in the 90s, like on a tape, recording your favorite tunes to give to someone. Doing these playlists is kind of similar to that. And not only is it sort of like playing to Spotify's algorithms, it's also giving your fans a bit of insight into what you like, which I think is important. And, considering you could then share that on Facebook and on your mailing list, you start to see how these things are all interconnected. And the big goal is to let people know sort of what you're about, as a musician, like what your influence is, what do you like, what sort of, what you're about. And I think playlists are a really good way of doing this. In terms of growing your profile on Spotify, obviously one sort of thing which you can schedule in excuse me, is pushing people to your Spotify from other places. So if you don't tell people about your new playlist or your update, then they're probably not just going to go on Spotify and find it, but, you know, regularly posting from Facebook and Instagram and newsletter about an update you've just done on your Spotify page is an interesting extra bit of content to add into the mix if you want to sort of get more traffic there. But obviously, as you all probably know, like playlisting is the way you can actually reach a lot of new people on Facebook, on Spotify. There's two sort of main areas of this. So firstly, there's this sort of like the famed like algorithmic, the official Spotify playlists, which is either sort of algorithms deciding based on a whole load of things, or it's actual people, jazz people at Spotify who listen to new releases and decide to put it on their big playlists. You know, this is not something you have too much control in. If it happens, it's great. I know a friend of mine in London who got added to a playlist and had like 5 million streams in a few months. You know, but there is a bit of luck down to that. In terms of the sort of like the technical side of things, to get that done, you need to release singles, ideally in advance. Like you need to have them uploaded to Spotify at least 2 weeks before, ideally like 2 months before, and you need to go onto Artists for Spotify and you need to submit that track for playlisting. There's a lot of guides. There's a specific guide on Spotify about how to do that, so I won't sort of talk you through that here. But that's the only way you can get added to a Spotify official playlist, is by submitting it when you release. You can't email someone, you can't pitch to someone. Every time you release anything on Spotify, you can submit one track for playlist consideration, which means if you release an album, you can submit one track from that. If you release 4 singles and then an album, you can submit each of the 4 singles and a track from the album. And this is a really good reason why releasing singles, if you're focused on streaming platforms, is a really good thing to do, because it gives you multiple chances to pitch your track for consideration for playlisting. The more sort of realistic and something you can control yourself way of getting more attention on Spotify is to pitch to all these millions of fan generated playlists, which are anything apart from the official playlists. Could be some jazz fan in their bedroom, it could be a big company, it could be, you know, a business who does that, creates playlists as what they do. But essentially this is people who outside of Spotify who create playlists, and you can find their contact details and you can pitch to them, just like you pitch to a promoter for a gig, just like you pitch to a journalist for press coverage. And you know, having a plan for this. So, you know, okay, this month I'm releasing a new single. I'm going to find 50 playlists that by searching, you know, using the search function on Spotify, that this would fit into. So, you know, if it's like a, I don't know, it's like a bebop track, you might search for all playlists that mention bebop or 40s or anything related to that in the title. You make a big list of all of those. You look at who's created the playlist and you do your sort of Sherlock Holmes work online to find email addresses for those people. It's kind of long, boring work, repetitive work, but the people that do it actually, you know, do see the results. And it's like a lot of these things. If you do the work that's kind of uncomfortable and tricky and a bit dull, maybe, you're probably going to be sort of winning against a lot of people who just don't bother doing it. So actually getting onto those playlists, you know, starting with playlists that have maybe 300, 400 followers, then 1,000 followers and 5,000 followers, and actually working on these. It's kind of like it feels a bit like a ladder. So you sort of level up each time, you pitch to bigger and bigger playlists, and these will bring in more sort of streams from different places. And Spotify notice these things. They notice when you're getting a lot of traffic from people who don't follow you, or when you're getting put into lots of other playlists. And, you know, best guess is, because they do let's keep their process kind of like a secret, is that, you know, they then have sort of humans specializing in each genre who are not just listening out for new releases and music, but they're getting notified when, like, okay, this track from this band is getting added to loads of playlists, or this one's getting a bunch of traffic at the moment, check it out, maybe put it into one of our playlists as well. And that's the way of sort of just building up that attention on Spotify as well. Does anyone have any questions from that initial introduction? Because I know a few people wanted to talk about it. No. Okay, Dara.
I have one question. Yeah,
sure.
I don't know if it's so relevant, but I've got lots of different sort of acts with different names and different overlapping genres, and like I haven't got many of them out there in the world, but I'd like to get them out there more. But like, for example, Spotify, should I have the different names for the different acts? Should I try to, it would be great if they were all under the one umbrella somehow. What would you recommend?
I mean, in an ideal world, they're all on one page, because then you're not splitting the traffic between different places. But it would be hard to combine things if they're completely different projects, because Spotify is very much like project based. So, you know, if it's a quintet and a quartet, you'd probably try and combine them all onto one page. But if it really is two different bands with two different identities and, you know, everything's different, then you would probably need to have them as separate pages. What you can do is put yourself as a sort of featured artist or a main artist on both, and then you would have your own page which pulled together all of your different releases. So that would be one way of doing it.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
But in terms of promoting on Spotify, it's very much like a track single based thing anyway. So, you know, you would pitch one single to the right, to, you know, if you have a track that's like a Latin or something, you'd pitch it to only playlists like that. And then you might have another band which is completely different, like folk music, and you pitch that to folk playlists. So it's not as complicated as pitching to press contacts, where they're going to be confused about which band is which and whatever, because you're only, you know, you can segment quite nicely and just pitch to the relevant people for each playlist.
Thank you.
Sure.
You know, return on investment. I mean, this takes a lot of time, you know, to kind of fold into the algorithms and try and maximize the exposure on the platform in order to progress, you know. Do you see much of a return in this space for the bands that you represent?
I mean, I think in terms of the investment, I think a lot of it you can sort of like, you can batch it up. So you know, firstly you get your profile looking great, and that's done. And then, you know, you might set reminders once a week that you're going to push people to you're going to update your playlist and push people there once a week. That's kind of done. I think the thing that takes a lot of time would be reaching out to a lot of playlists, which financially, I mean, I have some artists who, you know, they get a respectable income every month. Not I don't mean their whole wages, but I mean like, you know, considering if that continued for 10 years, then, you know, a good income from that. But I think more than that, it's just one place where I just feel like it's just another area that some promoters and people care about. So you want to get it up to at least a good standard. You know, you might not decide. Some musicians really dive into it and it's their thing and they spend a lot of time and maybe it does work out like that. But I think the alternative is you've got to just at least get it ticking over. But yeah, it's hard to quantify the results. So I wouldn't put it up there with, I'd say Bandcamp is much more important to put some time into,
right?
Even Facebook. You know.
Yeah, but it's part of a suite of things that you need to kind of have, like looking the same. You're talking about consistency in how things look, and consistency in the frequency of your communication and your updating of different things. And you mentioned Songkick as well, you know, so it's kind of like folding in these services to work in some sort of harmony. I feel like we need a flow chart or something to kind of figure out which comes first, you know, and which order to do the stuff, you know, but it's all very, very useful.
But I think a lot of these things it's unrealistic to think you're going to do all of this all the time, all these Facebook mailing list, everything. I think it works quite well to sort of work in like sprints. So you say like, right, this month I'm going to put in an hour a week or 2 hours a week on reaching out to playlists on Spotify, and then see what happens. And, you know, if there's a bit of a boost, then that's going to continue for longer than that week, and then, or that month. And then, you know, next month I'm going to get my incentives for my mailing list sorted, and I'm going to get all that tidied up, and I'm going to write a couple of automated mails, and that's going to then run for a year, potentially, just like keep going. So I think it's easy to get like so overwhelmed by everything that you do nothing. I think it's much better to say, I'm going to take one thing away that we've talked about today, and I'm going to do that, and that's going to make 3% difference, and that's better than nothing for now.
Well said.
Yeah.
And just,
Aoife has a question. Aoife Doyle.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah. So this is just a bit more of a general kind of a question, because like you got into the nitty gritty of certain things like Spotify there, which is very helpful. But I suppose just from a more broader perspective, I'm thinking about releasing music soon, and I'm trying to come up with a kind of a solid release plan. You know, and yeah, okay, work on Spotify and work on mailing lists and all that's all really good stuff. But I'm like, should I I'm sort of at the moment, I'm like, given the current climate, like I feel like I have to have video content anyway, for sure, for a number of the tracks, you know, to really have them have any kind of impact, I suppose. And then I'm wondering, like, do I need to pay a PR person, or, you know, and I'm wondering when I should start doing all that. So maybe that's too broad of a question to answer now, but I wonder if there was any sort of a roadmap maybe that we could be emailed after or something in regard to releasing music in the current climate, and what are kind of the maybe even kind of a sort of a step by step, if that's not too much to ask. Like, I know that might be.
I mean, that's what we're going to talk about next, like about the industry thing, and I have an example of like doing an album release, so I'll talk through as much of that as I can now, and then if there's anything extra you want to know, I can send over some notes afterwards.
Super, thank you. That's brilliant.
So yeah, maybe that is a good segue, just because I know time's getting on to go through this last section. So, I mean, obviously all of this is sort of focused on audience development, but in terms of progressing your career, it's important to expand how many people you know in the industry and how well you're sort of connected with them. Obviously that could be lots of different roles, but mainly it's sort of press contacts and promoter contacts. If you've got a good bunch of promoters that you know and who will answer your emails, and the same with journalists, then you're in a really good position to release music and get gigs. You know, basically the more people you've got there, the more opportunities you have to get coverage. And I think it's really important, you know, not just to pay, you know, obviously paying a publicist or a magazine for advertising or an agent commission is a valid thing to do, but it's really important you sort of get those skills yourself as well and sort of build up the ability to connect with people personally, because I think also a lot of agents and record labels and managers, they also want to work with musicians who sort of know the business and who have started up with their own connections as well. They don't want to just, okay, right, you do everything now. They want to have a musician who's really sort of involved with that and who people want to work with. I guess there's two sorts of types of people. Firstly, there's the people that on the industry that you already know, which sometimes it's easy to forget who they are. So a good exercise, which we often do, is like, sounds super simple, but basically just like getting a piece of paper and writing down everyone who you know in the industry, not who you know their name, but like you've had a conversation with, they've booked you, they've reviewed you, they've done something with you, getting that all down onto a piece of paper, because I've done this before and you always forget people. Oh, I forgot about this person. I didn't call her for ages. Firstly, that's just a really good reminder about checking in with people, because the worst thing is when you only reach out to people when you've got something you want, like, oh, I've got a new album out, can I give this to you? It's much better if you've kept in touch with these journalists and promoters sort of in between a bit as well. Not like be their best friend, but like just check in with them and, you know, provides a bit of value as well, not just ask for stuff. But I guess the most important thing, especially when we're talking about releasing an album, is sort of expanding your network. And we do press campaigns as of like a couple of years, and we have a sort of quite a rigid format that we follow, which you guys can copy exactly and which works for us. In terms of timing, if you're releasing singles, we'd normally start like at least 2 months before with the singles. You want at least 3 weeks in between each single, so you can sort of work back from the release, depending on how many singles you're doing. Obviously there's loads of situations where you might change this, but this is just to give you one sort of model that you can sort of play around with. We like to release singles firstly for Spotify, but also because it gives you much more time to shout about your release to your fans and to build attention, and it just gives you much more news to share rather than, I've got an album coming. You know, instead of that, you've got 2 months before, oh, here's a single. By the way, you can pre-order the album on Bandcamp now. And suddenly your campaign started and you've got 2 whole months before it even comes out where you can sort of like legitimately be talking about it. In terms of press, we try and follow this pattern of basically we look at all the similar artists, so who are making similar music at a similar level or maybe a little bit ahead. This works for gigs as well. And we basically scour Google for all the press coverage those bands have had. We make a big list. We don't just list the magazine or the blog, we list the specific writer as well. And then we find the email address for all of them if we haven't got them already. And I would say like 99% of email addresses are findable online. They might not be just there on their website, but you can, you know, there's lots of free tools. You can find these email addresses. And then we make a big long list of 50 or so contacts who we feel pretty sure will like the record because they've reviewed similar things before. We then write an email, like a template pitching email, which has a really, hopefully an engaging subject line, because, you know, the goal of that is just to get them to open it, not like review request, but something a bit more sort of like interesting. And we have a very, very short, like 2-sentence, 3-sentence description of the project musically, just enough to try and get them to listen, because that's the real goal. And we have the listen links, and then we have sort of a call to action, like, you know, would you be interested to check this out? Do you want a physical CD? Something like this. And before we send each one, we personalize the opening depending on who we're sending it to. So we might say, oh, we saw you reviewed this band last year. We've got an album coming out, and, you know, we work with a similar lineup or a similar style, so we thought you might like this. And immediately that just tells the person, like, okay, this isn't a mass mail out, this is a personal email. And more than that, they've done their homework, they know who I am, they know what I write about, and they still felt like it was worth reaching out. And that has a massive impact compared to like adding 50 email addresses to a newsletter and just blasting it out. People, loads of journalists have told us they feel much more sort of obliged to reply to an email when it's written to them, whereas a newsletter is really easy just to like delete. And everyone knows when they're being mass mailed. I do that myself. I know if anyone writes to me personally, I always reply. If I get added to a newsletter or a BCC long list, I just delete it, because you never know if it's actually relevant for you, because it's obviously not been written to you. So we send this first round of emails out about 2 months, ideally, before the album comes. And then about 3 weeks later or so, or 4 weeks later, we'll send another email to everyone who didn't reply to the first one, which is, you know, normally a substantial chunk, saying, oh, you know, normally as a reply to the previous one, saying, oh, we sent you this mail, we thought you'd like this record because of this and this. Did you get a chance to check it out? Here's the link again, you know, thanks. And then a couple of weeks later, or maybe around the release date, we'll email everyone who didn't reply to that one a third time and say, look, obviously you're busy, we won't bother you again, but just, you know, we did think this was your cup of tea because of this and this. So, you know, here's the final like link for it. And then we stop. And you'll be amazed the amount of reviews we get from the second or third email, because people didn't ignore the first one because they didn't like it. They just get so many mails. And even journalists reply saying, oh, I'm so sorry, like I didn't reply to your first two, like I'm definitely gonna listen to it now and I'm gonna review it. So I think that's those two things are the biggest takeaways for running a campaign, is firstly to always write personally. Don't mass mail anyone who can offer you something as valuable as a gig or a review or something like that. I mean, you kind of have to mass mail your fans, because hopefully it's too big a number to write to personally. But if you really want something, you know, from someone in the industry, write to them personally and just actually try and create that connection. And even if they don't review you or book you, they'll probably appreciate that connection and they'll know who you are next time as well. I can see from Beck's a comment saying, I've had feedback from journalists and promoters that it's okay to keep writing until I get a no, sometimes get a reply on email 5 or 6 even. Yeah, absolutely. I think the biggest mistake some musicians make is, which is natural because it's very personal, like sending your music to someone and asking them to like if they like it or not, but giving up too soon, because so many promoters or journalists, they're so busy, they don't, you know, they just can't check everything all the time. And they will, I think most of them appreciate, as like, you know, as like Ken said, as long as you're, or Beck said, as long as you're polite. And I think that's where the research is important, because if you're just emailing someone who reviews completely different music, they're probably going to be a bit annoyed. But if someone can see that you've done your homework and you know they've reviewed similar things and you've read their work before, I can't really see how they can be annoyed. They might say no, or they might not review it, but it's not really an intrusion because you're, you know, it's relevant for them. So that's kind of like in a very quick, in a nutshell, how we work those campaigns. And I guess, yeah, be personal and follow up would be the two takeaways. Yeah.
Just one thing about Spotify, like, should you put like all your music on Spotify? Let's say you have loads of stuff on Bandcamp. Should you put all that stuff on Spotify as well, or should you just put a little bit and then try and get those Spotify fans to maybe come over to Bandcamp? Is that a technique that's used, or is that?
I mean, I've certainly seen musicians do that. I tend to feel that people don't buy records because they can't get it on Spotify. They buy it because they really like the band and want to support them and want to have, like, it's like people buying a CD at the end of the gig. It's because they want to like have a memory of the gig and a signed CD. And
for sure,
that's my sort of anecdotal experience, is that people buy music to support the band regardless of if it's available for free or not.
Right. So just put everything on Spotify, kind of, then would be a general rule of thumb.
I would, if I was releasing music, I would do that. But
right.
Obviously, everyone's different, and every situation is different. But yeah.
No, that's cool. Thank you.
Sorry, Matt, just a little question. You've just given a really good description about how you would go about a promotion campaign for press media. But what about a promotion? What about thoughts for airplay or getting the music out there through radio stations?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, like radio plugging is kind of can be a whole career in itself, and we wouldn't sort of call ourselves that. We do get radio play, but we get it from the same method by emailing. You know, we try and figure out if the producer is deciding or if the host is deciding. So we're emailing the right person. Excuse me, and then we do email. I guess the only difference is we email like a link to download the WAVs rather than streaming links. And we might pick out a track and say, we felt this track might be most interesting for you. But we would go about it in the same way. And, you know, we've had coverage on like, you know, Jazz FM and Radio 3 and that sort of stuff by doing it like that. Does anyone else have any other questions? I think that's probably all we've got time for other than that.
It is, unfortunately. Well, let's see. I mean, I think Edel had a question.
Yeah, just a question. I guess in the past I would have, I suppose, been known more from the jazz side of things, and I have a new album coming out soon, and I wouldn't really describe it as jazz, but my contacts are kind of in the jazz world, so I'm wondering, should I try and tap into those, even though it's not really jazz, or should I be kind of just starting from scratch?
I mean, if I was you, I'd probably want to contact the 50 or however many you decide most relevant people, regardless of how, I mean, if there's some existing contacts that you feel like it might be relevant, and because you know them, you can sort of put it out there and say like, you know, it's not completely your thing, but I'd probably want to find those people that are reviewing really similar projects to like, it's definitely more work, but I think it would probably be worth it.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, I think we will. I mean, we have to leave it there. I just want to say thank you very much, Matt. Extraordinary amount of information in a relatively short amount of time. So thank you sincerely for that. I think you said it earlier on. I mean, it's very easy to get overwhelmed, you know, and do nothing because there's so much. You know, it could be any of these things. But I suppose this is about a strategy and kind of a plan, and then dividing it up into manageable chunks. You have loads of info on your website. Do you want to just talk briefly about jazzfuel.com before you go, and just to explain your thought behind it? Because I know you've got a subscription on that website. Do you want to talk about that for a second? Because I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the site was the goal with the site was just to provide information that wasn't out there, stuff that any agent or promoter could talk about, but it wasn't really published. So I was just trying to publish those sort of basics, and getting interview guests, written interview guests, which we had about 40 or 50 now, just to share their advice as well, and to provide information on Spotify and mailing lists and that sort of thing. But obviously a lot of those things are firstly changing quite quickly, and secondly, need more in-depth support. So I have this sort of private membership site where people join and they get access to, we do live sessions like this every couple of weeks, and we have mini sort of courses on Facebook and mailing lists and Spotify. So it's kind of like for musicians who don't have a manager, they want to have the feedback. It's kind of centered around a forum, so people can ask questions and interact all the time with me. But then rather than me doing stuff like I might if I was a manager, because that's not possible to scale, there's resources and guides and video things to actually show people how they can do that. So, it's kind of an in-between step, I guess. It still requires a lot of work, but at least the sort of, I guess, the roadmap's there, and it's kind of, a bit more organized. And we do sort of challenges like this month. Everyone's trying to get one track on a Spotify playlist, for example. So that whole thing of just like having a bit of accountability with other people rather than having to do it all yourself, I think helps quite a bit.
That sounds like a killer New Year's resolution. I mean, a lot of people are calling January Jamuary and posting up jams, you know, that they're doing online of music. I've seen that, a lot of that already. Yeah, I love the creativity. But it's interesting because, I mean, of course, we've got resource articles on our website at improvisedmusic.ie. But you know, when we're talking about what resource article we want to compile, quite often I'll go, sure, Matt has already done something like this on Jazzfuel. I mean, you know what I mean? We're kind of, you know, he's already been there and kind of done that. So, you know, I encourage everyone really to check out the Jazzfuel website and become a subscriber if you want. I mean, that's entirely up to yourself. But for now, for today, that wraps us up. Thanks again, Matt, and thank you all for joining us.